the theme of this weekend is socialism or barbarism. And one thing I think we can all agree, in fact, people who don't even consider themselves socialists probably agree, is that if the problem of climate change is not dealt with as an urgent matter, if it's not dealt with correctly, it absolutely can lead to catastrophe for humanity that will look like barbarism. And I don't think you have to be a socialist or a Marxist to understand that or to accept that. And I would say this, climate change is a problem facing humanity, but it's also a class question. Yes, it does face humanity as a whole, but it's also a class question. And in this discussion, I want to make the case that a solution to climate change lies with the establishment of a workers' government. And that this workers' government is not only going to deal with climate change, it's going to deal with other major problems facing the working class today, such as unemployment, low wages, expensive health care, or in some cases not having health care, poverty, instability, police brutality, war, etc. In fact, all of these problems are linked to the problems of climate change because it's a systemic problem, and I'm going to get to that. So the first thing I'd like to say is this must be looked at as a class question. And the thing is as people born and raised in the United States, I won't necessarily say the same maybe for Britain or for Canada, but in the United States, I would say that we live in a class society that pretends that it's not a class society. We are told by the ruling class, which dominates the education system, the political system, the economic system, the media, right? We're told by this ruling class to think of things in terms of our country, our government, what's in our interests, right? So that we buy in to their control, to their ruling class system. But the first question I would ask is, when they talk about our country, whose country is it? Whose country? Because if you look at the figures, the top 10% of the population, now if we talk about the top 10%, we're talking about the richest 1 or 2%, the ruling class, along with the upper middle class that's linked to them. The top 10% owns 84% of the value of all shares of stock. And what are shares of stock? Shares of stock are proof that you own a part of a corporation, part of a company. And these companies own the means of production. They own the land, they own the mines, they own the natural resources, they own the factories, the real estate, the office buildings. They own basically everything. As we mentioned, just the top 500 companies control 2/3 of the economy in this country, right? So only 10% of the population owns 84% of all the value of all the stock. They basically own the country. It's their country. By the way, I'd also make a point that if you say the bottom 90% own 16% of the value of the stock, most of those shares of stock are just like 1 or 2 shares that people own in their 401k plan or their IRA plan, and that's because they took away the pensions and they forced people to save for their own retirement, right? That's why you might have a few shares of stock owned by some of the people in the bottom 90%. So that's whose country? It's obviously their country. They're the ones that own it. And you ask, whose government? Now, the government in this country is usually run by one of 2 major parties, or sometimes combinations of both of these parties, right? The 2 major parties in this country, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, are both owned and controlled by the ruling class. Their decisions that they make when they're in government are made to protect and maintain and defend the capitalist system, which serves the interests of this richest 1 or 2% who run society. So I would argue there's no government of the capitalist class, whether it's the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, a combination of the Democrats and Republicans, because that's what we have right now in this country, right? You have the Republicans control the White House and the Senate, and the Democrats control the House. It's really a coalition between the 2 parties, right? But neither party, if it controls all 3 branches, nor would some combination be able to solve these problems or serve the interests of the working class. And I would also include this. I would say even if you had a Democratic Party government, and even if it was dominated by, quote, progressive Democrats, that will not solve the problems facing humanity, the problems facing the people who live in what is called the United States of America. So let's take a look at some facts about climate change first, to just get a sense of what we're dealing with. Now, some basic facts. Since 1750, so it's, talking about a little bit over 200 years, right? 250 years. Since 1750 to the present, the Earth's temperature has gone up 1 degree Celsius. We're using the metric system for the purposes of these facts and figures. 1 degree Celsius from that period. Now, just to show you, this I thought was enlightening to show you how the Earth is warming. Since 1880 to 1981, about 101 years, if you combine the land and ocean temperature, in that period, it went up usually 0.07 degrees Celsius per year, every year. So 0.07 degrees Celsius every year for 101 years it went up. Now, if you look at things since 1981, if you look again at combined land and ocean temperature, it's gone up an average of 0.17 degrees, so it's more than doubled, 0.17 degrees Celsius per year, every year. So you've seen a more than doubling of the rate of heating up of this planet. Now, in terms of the future problems, everybody's heard of the Paris Agreement, right? The Paris Accord, that all the imperialist countries, the capitalist countries get together and they sign this, this statement saying, we're going to really try to deal with the issue of climate change. We want to prevent bad things from happening. So what does the Paris Accord basically do? What is the goal, or let's put it this way, what is the goal of the Paris Accord, right? They want to limit the global warming, they want to limit the increase of temperature to 2 degrees Celsius from the level it was in the pre-1850, 1900 period, okay? So whatever the rough estimate of what the Earth's temperature was at that time, pre-1850, 1900, they don't want it to go above 2 degrees above that. Now, whether or not they'll be able to achieve that, we should point out that scientists say that never mind if it gets to 2 degrees above that level. If it gets 1.5 degrees above that level, there's going to be much devastation. For example, they estimate if you get 1.5 degrees Celsius above the level of 1850, 1900, you're going to have destruction of 70 to 90% of coral reef building, 99% of tropical reefs will die, and 25% of all marine life, of all sea life, depends on this. You're going to have massive destruction that's going to massively dislocate the ecological balance, and of course it's going to hit the industry, the fishing industry, and all the related industries. And of course, coastal areas and some islands will be threatened by the flood, by water. And I should point out, this meeting is taking place on an island, Manhattan Island. So Manhattan Island can be threatened by this because think about it, I don't know how many people were here during Hurricane Sandy, but if you remember at Hurricane Sandy, at the height of the storm, if you're in Battery Park was really becoming Battery Lake. The water was coming up, So these are serious, serious problems, but those are, for the most part, off into the future if the climate continues to heat up just as little as a degree and a half Celsius from where it was 1850, 1900. Now, how about right now? That's the future. What about right now? This year, 2019, they estimate doubled the combined population of New York City and Chicago, we're talking about 24 million people, have to move this year because of climate change. 24 million people. That's right now. That's not in the future. That's if this happens, this is right now. It's a serious problem for the future. It's a serious problem right now hitting humanity. Jakarta, Indonesia. It's the fastest sinking city on Earth. And it's a coastal metropolitan area of something like 10 million people. These are serious, serious problems. Now, we hear all these things. We're constantly being bombarded by how bad things are. But what you don't hear as much in the bourgeois media is what is the cause? What is the underlying cause for these environmental problems? And I noticed one of the facts I wrote down, it's actually right on a sign right over there. If you take a look at 100 big companies, and most of these companies are mainly big fossil fuel producers, they're responsible for over 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions. 100 companies. This highlights where the real blame for climate change is. It's not a policy question, right? It's not about lesser evilism. It's about the need to take over these companies, to transform, to have democratic control over production. That's the place that we have to look to solve the problems of climate change. In private hands, monopolies generate obscene amounts of profit, obscene amounts of waste, and of course, an obscene amount of environmental damage. As we know, capitalists, the one thing they don't like is to pay for anything, right? When they produce things and they're making profits, if they can take the waste, if they have to pay to put that waste away in a safe way, they don't like that. If they can dump it in somebody's lake or dump it behind somebody's yard, they'd be much happy. Anything that's cheaper or free is great for them. Anything that doesn't threaten their profits, they like. So in private hands, these major monopolies are creating a horrible system of waste, of environmental damage. But if they were nationalized under a socialist economic plan, we could employ modern technologies, green technologies, and we could slash emissions. We could slash pollution in a number of years, just very, very quickly. I'll go into that a little bit more. And we can do this by providing quality food, quality shelter, education, transport, and healthcare for all. All of this is possible. Think about what is involved in solving climate change. You have, for example, you're going to have to relocate certain people, right? Certain amounts of the population, depending on where they live. That requires moving them from where they are into a place where they can have at least equal, if not better, conditions to live, right? But that involves, under capitalism, that involves property. Under socialism, it's not a problem. Under a planned economy, it's not a problem. We can plan to meet people's needs. We can plan to make sure that everybody has decent housing. But under socialism, we can imagine, under capitalism, you can imagine how these things are dealt with. How are things usually dealt with under capitalism? Well, if a rich man's home is threatened, they're ready to go out and to make sure that they pay him for any loss. Just like, remember during the economic crisis, these companies were going out of business. Oh, let's take the taxpayer fund and bail out these companies. Let's bail out the rich. That's the way capitalism handles things when the rich people lose their property. What happens when the poor and the working class lose their property? Does capitalism rush to bail them out? No. It's like, you're on your own, buddy. You made that mistake. That was your choice to live in that particular area. You can see these kinds of problems, how it would unfold under capitalism versus under a planned economy. It's really clear that what we need to do under a socialist planned economy in terms of climate change, we need to move people from one area to another. We're going to need large-scale mitigation projects and measures, such as construction of flood defenses. We're going to have to do reforestation. We ultimately need international action, because not only can't you have socialism in one country, but you can't solve the climate crisis in one country as well. We have to have control over production, control over emissions, and that has to be an international task. And if we don't, and to me, if we're going to be able to control those resources, plan those resources, solve that problem, it goes without saying that we can't control what we do not own, which really means that we need a socialist planned economy to deal with the climate change. Now, I just wanted to bring up this question. The Green New Deal has come up as a proposal to try to solve the climate change question. And I just wanted to deal with the Green New Deal for a second. I will give Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez credit in the sense of, by proposing an idea on how to deal with the environmental catastrophe and trying to get that out for political discussion, that is a step forward as far as it goes. But the problem with Ocasio-Cortez's proposal for a Green New Deal is, I don't know how many people are aware, her proposal, if it passes Congress, is a non-binding resolution. So that means if it passes Congress, it says The Congress will, in the future, deal with all these problems. How many people believe that the United States Congress, if they pass that resolution, is going to deal with all these problems, right? It's really, there's a good effort there to try to get the discussion out to people, but we're discussing the wrong thing if we're discussing a non-binding resolution. I think what would have been preferable is if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez instead made her Green New Deal proposal a proposal to nationalize those 100 companies that are creating all those emissions problems, put it under Democratic workers' control, and propose that as the beginning of a solution to deal with the climate change. Now, the fact is, if she had proposed such a thing, if it was a binding resolution taking socialist measures into account, the co-sponsor of her bill is a Democratic senator from Massachusetts, Ed Markey. And probably people will say, well, he won't co-sponsor that kind of bill. Well, that's too bad. But the point is by putting forward that legislation, even if she didn't have a co-sponsor, she could really shift the debate and the discussion in this country. Because she's not only highlighting the fact that climate change is a major problem, she's actually also highlighting where the cause of the problem is, the cause of capitalism and the profit motive of these corporations, and she's pointing towards the solution. And linked with that, she could have made a point and said, there's no senator, by the way, maybe she would have got Bernie Sanders to co-sponsor it in the Senate. Who knows, right? But assuming not, she could use that as a way to make the argument of why the working class needs its own party, why we need to elect socialist, working class candidates, independent of the Democrats, independent of the Republicans, standing for those kinds of proposals. And that would help to really transform politically. And it would break this idea of any kind of illusions that the US Congress, as it is constituted today, or even as it's constituted after the next election next year, is going to be any kind of solution to this problem. Now, I want to repeat, today, with the level of technology we have, with the level of understanding we have, fighting climate change is not a technological problem. That's not the issue. It is a political problem. It is a question of political and economic power. That's where we have to take this issue. That's why I'm saying it has to be made as a class issue. It's not a question of we haven't invented the technologies that can solve this problem. That's not the question. The question is about political power. It's about economic power. That's where the discussion needs to be taken. And so I would, by the way, I'm not against, personally, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. If I got a chance to speak to her, I would advocate that she do this and move this in the right direction. But that's where this movement needs to go. That's where we have to start looking. Now, I think the climate change really poses a question between two systems. We have, on the one hand, the present system, capitalism, which is causing the problem. Capitalism is a system that's geared towards accumulating capital, right? That's why it's called capitalism. It's there to accumulate capital. And too much is never enough for capitalism. It doesn't matter what the negative effects are. That's what the goal is of the system. The system functions according to the market, by the way. Anybody who tries to think that they can solve climate change by putting a tax incentive here or the regulation there, that's not going to solve it, because it's caused by the market system. It's caused for the drive for profit, and taxing something or putting regulations on something is not going to shift it from market-based decisions about where money is invested, where machinery is invested, what they do with the investment to expand technology and expand production in the future. So capitalism is the cause of the problem. The other system which can solve the problem is socialism. Socialism, production for society, production to meet the needs of people. That's the ultimate solution. Once again, that poses the question. It's a class question, because you can't get to socialism unless the working class has its own political party and establishes itself as a government, wins over the support of the majority of the working class and can establish a workers' government. So we believe really the only solution to the climate change problem, the only solution to all these other problems, is the establishment of a workers' government on a socialist program, which would have socialist policies. So let me go into what we mean by a workers' government. Of course, in order to have a workers' government, you first need a political party, right? You need, and we discussed this a bit yesterday, We need a mass working class socialist party that will be under the democratic control of the members of that party. And that party would look for support among workers from in all sections of the working class. And in fact, by the way, I'd also like to mention that the struggle to build such a party and the struggle to establish a working class government, as part of that process, would unite people along class lines. We know in this country there's a big heritage of racism. There's a big heritage of sexism. There's a big heritage of all the other kinds of forms of discrimination. And all of these forms of discrimination, all of these forms of division have been used to keep the majority, the vast majority, the working class, divided, fighting amongst themselves, not seeing who the real enemy is, the class enemy, the ruling class. So part of the process of building such a party, gaining a vast majority of support among the working class and establishing a workers' government, is to overcome these divisions. It's for people to see that they have more in common, at least in terms of their class interests, than they have differences. And it's through that process that we would do a lot to mitigate all these problems of racism, sexism, and other kinds of division and discrimination. I'm not saying, by the way, all of that will disappear, but I'm saying in the course of struggle that a lot of that stuff will be mitigated and it'll be reduced. And you'll see the people will come together and be able to build a new society, which eventually will be based not on division, not on dividing people and getting them to fight against each other, but to work together for a better world. Now, if the working class established its government, there's no question that government could not function unless there were committees set up of the working class, organized in all of the factories, in all of the mines, in all of the workplaces and offices, in all of the working class neighborhoods. There would have to be elected committees of the working class at all of these places. And these committees would elect representatives, and the representatives would come together on a local level. They would come together on a regional level. They would come together on a national level. This kind of system, right, the system of workers' councils, what the Russians called Soviet, this kind of system would not only help us organize and run society in a better way, but it's a way of getting information from below up to the top where it can be coordinated, and to get coordination from the top down to the people so they know what to do locally. Because we all need each other. We have to work together. It has to be unified. You can't just break off, parts of the society and split us up into some sort of autonomous, regions or whatever. We need to work together. We need centralization. We need coordination, but it's got to be done in a democratic way. So a workers' government, I think, would be done on the basis of these kinds of organs, these kinds of committees that would be set up around society. Now, if this workers' government, and I'm going to go into the question of the policies in a second, but if this workers' government was established in the United States first, I'm not predicting that it would happen first, although, as Rob said, maybe the last will be first and the first will be last. United States today is the citadel of world capitalism. It's a citadel of world imperialism. If we were just making a prediction today, we would probably not say that there will be a workers' government in the United States first before it happens in any other country. But let's just say, hypothetically, it did happen here first. If the working class took power in the United States first, the world would be free. You'd have an end to U.S. imperialism, U.S. capitalism, and its rule around the world. The most reactionary force that exists around the world would be taken down. The example of the American working class taking power away from the ruling class would be a political earthquake around the world. I think, for example, it would extremely demoralize the ruling class in every other country of the world. Rob can correct me. I think if that happened, if there was a workers' government in the United States based on a socialist program, I really think the Queen of England would just give up her crown and run out the gates of the palace and run for the hills, whatever. Because I really think, I can't see any other ruling class thinking that they were going to fight to maintain capitalism after that happens. It'd be an enormous blow. But that establishment of a workers' government, a socialist government here, would be a huge attraction to the working class all around the world. Now people, instead of seeing the U.S. as an enemy, Instead of seeing the US government as a force that's going to come down and support their local ruling elite and their exploitation and all that, now they could see the working class and the government established here as an ally, as somebody that can help transform their lives, can make their lives better, even in their own countries, can link up their economies with a socialist America. Now, one of the first things that could be done, because the US government would no longer be a capitalist imperialist government, no longer maintaining an empire and trying to keep people down, we could have massive cuts in the military budget. And I don't know if people are aware, but this is according to what they report. I know that whatever the real budget is, it's not probably the same as what they publicly report. It's probably larger. There's probably more money going into the military than they say. But just in terms of what's publicly reported, if you look at like the US military budget, the so-called intelligence budget, that's the CIA, the NSA, the spy system, the Department of Energy, which a lot of that is just building nuclear weapons and stuff like that, right? If you add that all together, it's something closer to $800 billion is spent on that part of the military budget. Now, that's part of a whole apparatus, a whole empire that exists for US imperialism. You know, if you take three imperialist countries, Britain, France, and Russia, if you combine their foreign bases, the three countries together, those three countries have 30 military bases, 30 foreign military bases around the world, Britain, France, and Russia. The United States alone has 800 military bases in 70 countries. There's nobody can challenge the U.S. It's a huge military octopus that exists around the world. This could be massively cut. Like I said, the world would be free. The working class would look to the workers' government here as people who could be collaborated with, who they could work with to improve their conditions of life. They wouldn't look at the United States the way it's looked at today under the rule of capitalism. Now, what would a workers' government with socialist policies look like? There's a few policies I want to go into, and I'm going to go into each a little bit more in detail. One of the things we would argue is that this government would nationalize the top 500 corporations, and we'll get into that in a second. Another thing is that they would shorten the work week with no loss in pay. And by the way, in addition to that, we'd establish a $25 an hour minimum wage to raise pay for the lower paid sections of the working class. We'd also establish universal health care, free at the point of service, and we would institute a program of useful public works, particularly on housing, which I'll get into. So let me go into some of the details of how we would implement these different policies. First of all, the first and most important measure that needs to be taken, because it's the measure that allows us to implement all the rest of the measures, is to take public ownership over the top 500 companies and put it under workers' control and management. 500 companies, top 500 companies, corporations, control, as we explained, 2/3 of the economy. Now, a lot of people ask you, will you pay for these companies? And we have an answer for them. We've already paid for these companies. The working class has already paid for these companies because the working class is not, these companies made money off the labor of the working class, off the unpaid labor of the working class. When you go to work on a typical day, if you're an average worker, if you worked an 8-hour day, probably about 3 hours on average, or maybe 3.5 hours, you are working and creating value for that company that comes back to you in terms of wages and benefits. The rest of the day that you're working, you are creating value for that company that doesn't go into your pocket, it goes into the pocket of the rich people. It goes in, it's the unpaid labor of the working class. So the working class doesn't have to pay for these companies. The working class has paid for these companies. All this money that these companies have accumulated, all this capital that's been accumulated, comes from the unpaid labor of the working class. Now let's take a look at some numbers, and I'm going to use 2017 numbers because those were the ones that were more finalized and not estimated in terms of gross domestic product. Now, you hear these numbers, and by the way, I want to mention something. The statistics that the capitalist class keep, right? The capitalist class is not Marxist. They don't take statistics exactly the way Marxists would take statistics. So when we use these numbers, we're using them as approximations. We know it's not exactly the way we would keep the numbers, but it's the only numbers that we have access to. It gives us an approximate idea of what's going on. Now, we talk about gross domestic product, right? Gross domestic product is the accumulation of how many goods and services are produced in a given year in a given country, gross domestic product. Now, remember, that is all produced, those goods and services all produced from the labor of the working class. Now, if you use 2017 figures, thank you. If you use 2017 per capita GDP figures, it comes out in the United States that roughly $59,500 was produced per person in the United States. That's taking the total GDP divided among the people that live in this country. But not every person in this country is a worker, right? Because some people are kids, some people are retired, some people are middle class or whatever. You have different people are in different situations. So if you look at the labor force, 160 million people in the labor force, and you take that GDP figure and divide it by that, it's basically a rough estimation that each worker in a per capita, in a per worker sense, produces more than $120,000 a year in goods and services. Think about that. The working class per worker per year is producing more than $120,000 worth of goods and services. Well, what do they get back from that production? Well, in 2017, median household income was only $61,372. Now think about that. Median household, we're not talking about wages, we're talking about the household income. In that household income, you might have two people who are working. So two people's wages adds up to $61,000, not $61,000 per person, right? Median wage means half of the households are making that money or less, half of them are making more. Here's another fact. Almost 95% of the working class in the United States, or the people who are in the labor force, are making less than $100,000 a year. Now, by the way, if you're making $100,000, you're still not up to that $120,000 level. We should point that out, right? But 95% of the people make less than $100,000 a year. So it just shows you where all that surplus is going. It's like we were just saying, this unpaid labor of the working class, as Marx explains, goes into the hands of the ruling class. It becomes rent, interest, and profit. Going in this, what we call the surplus value, is extracted by the capitalists, and it goes into those categories. And you could see the growing disparity that's developed under capitalism through this system of exploitation. Like, just to give you an example from the New York Times, recently they said, over 3 decades, right, over the last 3 decades, the top 1%, top 1% grew their net worth by $21 trillion. Top 1% grew their net worth by $21 trillion. During that same period, the bottom 50% of the United States, so it's 1% versus 50, saw their net worth decrease by $900 billion. So if you have any idea why that is occurring, we understand it as Marxists. We know it's a byproduct of the exploitative system of capitalism. It's not a question of taxing people. It's not a question of wealth taxes or income taxes. If you do that, whenever that's been tried, right? Like there's these proposals by Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren about taxing wealth, right? Now, first of all, this is my prediction. Even if they got that passed through the Congress, highly unlikely, right? I can guarantee you the U.S. Supreme Court will rule that unconstitutional, right? Because they had to pass a constitutional amendment to tax income. They haven't passed a constitutional amendment to tax wealth, and you know that ain't going to pass. They aren't going to pass that. So you can guarantee the Supreme Court's going to rule it unconstitutional. But whether that happened or not, even if they passed it, even if the courts say it's constitutional, what do the rich do when it comes to taxes? They find ways to hide their money. It's not the solution. Taxing the rich is not, we're not against taxing the rich, but it's not the solution. The solution is taking control of these companies. Then we would have control of all this surplus value and where we where we can invest it and where we can direct it. Now, once we start with that premise of nationalizing the top 500 corporations under democratic workers' control and management, what would be the next thing? The question of the shorter work week and no loss in pay. I would say this. If we could keep production at roughly the same level, as it was, let's say, before the establishment of the workers' government. We would do a number of things. We would redistribute this wealth, right? And we would shift what we produce, right? So we can shift what we produce, and doing that, we would make sure that no workers are going to be hurt in this shift of production. So, for example, that's also to deal with the question of climate change. Because, for example, it may be true that we would go towards more renewable sources of energy, like solar, like wind, and the hydropower, and those kinds of sources of energy, right? And if you did that, you might shut down the coal industry. In fact, the coal industry, even under capitalism, is collapsing. You know, it's basically the amount of people employed in that has been going down for years, right? That would probably the shift away from coal would continue under socialism. But the difference is this: under capitalism, when they put these people out of work, they're thrown out onto the street. There's no other place for them to go. There's no place for them to make comparable wages. Under socialism, we would insist that any changes in production, any shift in production, would be done in a way to protect the workers who have to be shifted to a new industry. So we would say, for example, with the coal miners, that they should be guaranteed their wages and benefits. They should be guaranteed their wages and benefits. If they need to be retrained, they'd be retrained at the expense of the state, of the public entity. We would retrain, and we would make sure that any job that they go to in the future, they at least are making the wages and benefits that they were making before. In fact, as a general rule, we want to raise wages for everybody. We want to make people, more highly paid, living in a much better situation, right? So we would make sure that any expense that's caused by transforming the society into a more ecologically sensible society is that expense is borne by the rich. Or it's taken by society after we've taken over these top 500 corporations, that it's not done at the expense of the working class. Now, we could shift a lot of kinds of production because we could spend more to produce renewable energy sources. We would also, not only that, but construct new buildings and new machineries that would be done in a more efficient way. That from a point of view of energy, they would use the same or less energy and they would produce more. That's all technologically feasible. And we could also retrofit older models, older machines, older buildings, whatever, and do that in a way that's more energy efficient. And also in the future, under socialism, I believe we would have planned communities. And planned communities, part of that planned community, we could plan to, for example, reduce commuting time. How much energy is wasted on commuting time? Not only it's valuable time of the worker that is spent taking an hour and a half, talking from New York City standards, an hour and a half, 2-hour ride to work, and an hour and a half, 2-hour ride back. You have all these problems of losing your time. But think of the enormous amount of energy that's spent and wasted by that kind of setup of that system. This could be changed under socialism. Now, the question of shortening the work week with no loss in pay. I believe the day the workers' government took power, the immediate pronouncement could be made that we would reduce the work week from 5 days a week to 4 days a week. So we'd all have a 3-day weekend every week. And the work day, instead of being 8 hours, could be 7.5 hours. So immediately, the day that the workers' government took power, I think we could immediately go to a 30-hour work week. I think within a few years, or maybe sooner, we could go to a 20-hour work week. And this could be done with no loss in pay. And I'm going to explain how this would work. Now, if you just kept everything the same and you did reduce the amount of work hours, production would go down. That's true. But I think this could be counteracted by increases in productivity, which I'm going to explain, and increases in production, which I would also explain. Now, first of all, productivity. Just by reducing the work week immediately to 4 days a week, 30 hours pay, means you have more rest. And people who are more rested are more productive. Think about how many people go to work and you're exhausted, you're tired, right? If you're well rested, if you're energetic, you can produce more. So just by immediately reducing the work week, giving people more time off, that immediately, I think, would lead to an increase in productivity. We have an example, concrete example under capitalism too, by the way, that if you take a look at France, which is a capitalist country, But because of the struggles of the working class, they have more time off, they have more paid vacations, they have younger retirement ages or whatever, right? That at least to some extent compared to the United States. If you look at the per hour per worker productivity of the French workers, they produce more per worker per hour than American workers, right? That shows you right there the benefit of being more well-rested. I think that's an example right there. A second point that would increase productivity. We would end the system, because we would have workers' control and management of industry, we would end that system of top-down management, authoritarian management, which comes under capitalism. You'd have a workplace that would be controlled by the people who know best how to produce things efficiently, the working class. I think we've all worked in a situation in a workplace where we know how to do things more efficiently, but the boss insists that they know better, and they force people to do things in an inefficient and ineffective way. This would be ended under socialism. You would see immediately there would be productivity increases by that. By the way, a lot of people will argue that if you have under socialism, you're going to have that worker, he's not going to want to do anything. What are you going to how are you going to deal with that worker who's not carrying their load at the workplace? I actually think under socialism, that's easily solved, right? Because if all of the workers feel that they're going to benefit from an efficient and effective workplace, because there are incentives that if we get more efficient and more effective, we can raise our wages and we can shorten the work week further with no loss in pay, then everybody has an incentive to work harder, number one. But number two, that particular person, if they did do that, they can be dealt with much more easily by the peer pressure of their coworkers than they can under a system of top-down management. So I think overall, workers' control and management would lead to a much better system. I'd also would say this, that you would need some supervisors and managers under the system, but again, they got to be watched by the elected committees of the working class, and they wouldn't be able to be these totalitarian or authoritarian managers and supervisors like they are today. But another thing is under this system is you would actually thin the lines of supervisors and managers, taking a lot, because all of us know, or many of us at least, have worked in workplaces which are extremely top-heavy, with these supervisors and managers, and you could take some of these people and actually take them out of supervision and management, put them on the line, and actually they could actually do some real work and really producing some real goods and services. And the final thing I would say, and this is of course the main motive in this situation, is you have an incentive, always have an incentive for the working class under this system to increase its productivity, to increase its efficiency, because the more productivity increases, the more efficiency increases within a system of good quality control. There's an incentive. They can have further reductions of the work week with no loss of pay, and they can have raises linked to that. This would enormously counteract any reduction in production that would be established by lowering the work week. It's through that path that I think we would easily get to a 20-hour work week very, very soon after the immediate introduction of a 30-hour work week. Now, I also think production would increase by other factors. First of all, we have a lot of unemployed people. Right now, this is the 10-year boom, the longest boom in recorded history in the United States, right? 10-year boom, right? There is, under the 10-year boom, would you believe there's 17 million people, right, who are really unemployed in one way or another? 17 million, at least. I think that's a conservative estimate. 17 million unemployed and underemployed people. These people would be taken under a socialist system, be given productive work. This would counteract any reduction in production. You also have a change in work for many people. For example, let's look at police and security. That would be eliminated because we would establish a system of workers' defense forces or workers' solidarity committees, however you want to say, workers' militia, however you want to term it, right? But that would take the place of the police. People would get time off from their job with pay to do those functions. That would be done collectively by society. People would be organized and be under the democratic control of the working class as a whole. But you wouldn't have these special people who are employed as police, as security, which is an enormous waste. These people provide nothing in terms of the production of goods and services. These people could be gainfully employed. We also have, and this is nothing personal, but people who are involved in the insurance industry, a lot of these people could be doing something productive. It's capitalism. I'm not blaming them. I'm not blaming them. But capitalism has this whole layer of people involved in pushing paper and throwing paper around. These people could be reemployed and doing something that's actually socially necessary. Or real estate agents, right? If there's, again, nothing personal. If there's any job that really doesn't really accomplish anything, it's a real estate agent, And a lot of these people could be put into real productive labor. I'd also say, in general, large chunks of government employees. I'm a former government employee, but I know from whence I speak. A lot of government employees could be given real work that's done that's necessary in terms of providing goods and services. There is some necessary statistics to keep on the government level. There's certain control that needs, certain technology jobs that can be linked to the government, coordination thing. But a lot of the people who are involved in government, it's paper pushing. And a lot of these people could be, again, reassigned to productive use. This would create an increase in production. By the way, there's an estimated, we would need, in my opinion, a socialist United States would need immigrants. We would, there's all this anti-immigrant. We actually need more people to come into the country to help construct socialism in the United States. That's how we can certainly talk about opening the borders under a socialist, because we're going to need these people. And just you talk about the underground economy. Some of these are illegal immigrants. It's something like $2 trillion, right? If you took these people and put them into a real economy, into a real, a socialist economy, they could be doing much more productive labor, providing real necessary goods and services. With any decrease in production under workers' government would come in the armaments industry, the weapons industry, the military industry, because all of that stuff, if you think about it, it uses up labor, and it either produces scrap metal because you don't use the stuff, or if you use the stuff, it's devastating. Like anyone who's working to produce nuclear weapons, you hope it's scrap metal, because if you use nuclear weapons, it's a horrible, devastating thing. So all we'd want to do is change people from producing that kind of scrap metal into producing real goods and services that people can use. And of course, in a socialist plan economy, we would take some of the money. There would be unpaid labor of the working class, so to speak, and some of that unpaid labor would be reinvested into new machinery, more efficient, more effective machinery, more ecologically sound machinery. We would be reinvesting. But what we wouldn't be doing is like the capitalists, where they reinvest in crap, like where they take money and they buy their own shares on the stock market or they speculate. That would come to an end under a socialist system. Within a few years, like I said, under this system, I think it might even be sooner than a few years, you could easily see us having a 5-hour workday, a 4-day work week, a 20-hour work week, and then eventually a 0-hour work week. Now, also think about this. As the working class proceeds to a lower and lower work week, as the working class gets more and more time off, more and more leisure time, some of that time, people will be producing goods and services from their labor, not from work, but from their labor. And it would be labor from which they are not alienated from. It would be, for example, someone who says, I like cooking. I want to work on Monday at the restaurant to do some cooking. Not because I'm getting paid, but because I like it, because I want to do it. I want to make people pleased with good, healthy food. People who might be trained as medical professionals who want to help care for the sick, but not because it's a job, but because they're going to do this. Eventually, as you reduce the work week to 0, as you get more leisure time, you have a growing body of goods and services that are going to be produced from labor, but not from work. Think about that. That's the path to a communist society. That's a path to a society with no classes. Now, I know I'm a little bit over time. I'll try to get through the rest of the stuff very quickly. I will just say healthcare. If you look at the healthcare situation, there's no country in the world where the healthcare system is such a fiasco as the United States. There's no country that spends more money on healthcare, and it still doesn't cover everybody, right? And it's an absolute mess, and it's an absolute problematic. There's a lot of perversions in healthcare by the capitalist system. I think under a socialist system, our goal would be to develop develop medicines and cures that looks to cure patients of ailments, not just to keep a sick person alive so that they can keep billing that person. That shouldn't be the goal. Under capitalism, there's all sorts of distortions. In the United States, for example, because you have the profit motive, a lot of money went into Viagra and plastic surgery, right? Which are, issues that you could link to, selling because sex sells, right? And all that. So they put a lot of money in, and not into, let's say, cures for cancer or something like that. Under a socialist system, we wouldn't be deciding where we're going to invest to look into cures for health ailments, for sickness and all that, based on profit. We'd be doing it from the basis of what society needs. And we can have a healthcare system. The United States spent $3.65 trillion on healthcare in 2018, which is over $10,000 a person per year. And by the way, over 10% of this cost have nothing to do with healthcare. It's all stuff that has to do with insurance and billing and this and that and all kinds of administrative waste that's in the system. So we could cover everybody universally and still save money. We probably could do it at least for $9,000, maybe even less than that, $9,000 a person to solve this. And if in a society where you have over $120,000 dollars worth of goods and services produced per worker, if you took the cost of the healthcare system at $9,000 per person, divided by workers, it'd come out to about $17,000 per worker per year. That could easily be covered from the goods, from the total wealth that's produced in society. Again, that's how we would pay for the healthcare. It would be paid for in a universal sense. When you went to get the healthcare, you wouldn't have to pay any money. Now, just finally, to sum up the last part, as I mentioned, we would have a program of public works. And one of the things we would start is the question of housing. Now, housing, immediately, there's a solution to the homeless problem. In this city and other cities, you have tons of empty luxury apartments that the rich own. The rich own these apartments, and they're completely empty. They use it like 1 week a year, and then the rest of the year, that apartment sits empty. We would grab those apartments. We would take it in the name of the workers' government, and we would establish a system to distribute housing, maybe based on a point system, to make sure that people who are homeless or people who are living in substandard housing or overcrowded get to be able to have a place to live. And rents would be no more than 10% of their income. Now, of course, we would produce more housing. We would construct more housing, and we even could develop planned communities with, thought in terms of transportation, walking, and all that. All of that could be done in the future. In those planned communities also, and even in these communities, in these cities, as we change them, we would create more parks, more recreation. Recreation and gyms would be free for people. By the way, that would also help reduce healthcare costs if you got people more involved in gymnastics and being active. We'd have more arts and entertainment facilities, so that not only New York has all these wonderful museums, but that you could go to small towns, small places around the country, and have access to live theater, have access to museums, have access to art. In fact, art and entertainment could be not just the privilege of a few, but it would be opened up to more people. I think also with more leisure time, more people would buy into that. We would also nationalize housework. Daycare. We would provide daycare and early child care and child education. This would allow the question of children. It wouldn't have to be a burden on the family or burden on the mother, but it would be more the responsibility of society to take care of all of these things. All of this can be done and within the establishment of a workers' government here in the United States, which I think would be the beginning. A socialist workers' government be established in Canada, Quebec, in Mexico, in Latin America. Before you know it, we'd have a socialist federation of North, Central, and South America. Now, comrades, I know I've gone a bit over my time, but I wanted to end my presentation on this because I thought this is from Eugene Debs. I don't know if it's from one of his campaign speeches, but I really liked it. And I thought I'd read it to end this because I think it sums up what the proposal is. Eugene Debs said, "We want the earth for all people. That is the demand. The machinery of production and distribution for all the people. That is the demand. The collective ownership and control of industry and its democratic management in the interest of all of the people. That is the demand. The elimination of rent, interest, profit, and the production of wealth to satisfy the wants of all of the people. That is the demand. Cooperative industry in which all shall work together in harmony as the basis of a new social order, a higher civilization, a real republic. That is the demand. The end of class struggles and class rule, of master and slave, of ignorance and vice, of poverty and shame, of cruelty and crime, the birth of freedom, the dawn of brotherhood, the beginning of man. That is the demand. This is socialism.